Hello and welcome to today's Authentic Communications Engagement webinar. My name is Georgie Statius and I'm from Fetching Events and Communications. And we'll just wait a couple of moments while people come online. While we do that, what I might do is get you to just pop in the chat box, and if you just change your settings to all panelists and attendees, and just let us know where you're joining us from. And we'll just wait a couple of minutes as people join the webinar. So while you're writing in the chat box of where you're joining us from, just want to do a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. That this webinar is being recorded and will be available for anyone who hasn't been able to attend, or if you've had to leave early, you will be able to access a recording of it. So if you just want to pop in the chat box where you're joining us from, just your name, and if you set it to all panelists and attendees. And we'll just wait as some more come online. So before we get started, I would like to, hello Karen from Canberra. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting today, because unlike usual events where we come together, we're actually all coming together from different parts of Australia. We've got people coming from Melbourne, fantastic, the Flying Doctor Service, hello Canberra. It's fantastic to have you on board, and I really want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all tuning in from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So as I said, my name is Georgie, I'm from Fetching Events and Communications, and I'm thrilled to deliver this webinar to you this morning. We'll go for an hour. We'll, I hope to talk for about 40 minutes, and then 45 minutes, and then we'll have a chance for questions at the end. So do feel free to keep making comments in the chat box, and then we'll have a section for questions at the end. So as I said, for those of you who've just joined us, we are recording this webinar as for a bit of housekeeping to let you know. So just give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering today. So I'll tell you a little bit about Fetching Events and myself. Because this webinar is about how we engage authentically during this time to build great engagement with our customers and our audience, in order to do that, we need to understand our customer. And in order to understand our customer, we need to understand what's going on at the current time. So we'll look a little bit at the research that's coming out of the sentiment and the mood during the current time. We'll also look back to history, because certainly none of us have all the answers, and we don't all necessarily know what's going to happen in the future, but we can certainly look to the past for our clues. We're then going to focus a little bit on purpose, because it's really important during this time of engaging authentically, and we'll talk about why authenticity is so important. Even though it's something that I'm very passionate about, it's never been more important than at a time like this, and really why we need to make sure we tie everything back to our purpose. Then we'll look to be, how can your brand, your association, your organisation be that loyal friend to your audience? And we'll step through things that you can do and things that you need to keep in mind as you communicate. And we'll also look at some good examples and some examples where they may have missed a fantastic opportunity where they could have really engaged a lot stronger. Then we'll look at some green shoots, so the positive that will come out of this and that we can all keep in mind, and then we'll end with some questions. So we'll start to dive into the webinar. So I'm going to turn my video off, and we'll get in and we'll get started. So as I said, none of us actually know the future, but it is important for us to consider some things as we go through and plan our communication. The first is that we're actually going through two situations. So we're going through a health situation at the moment, and you'll see I try and avoid the word crisis, because I think we need to be really careful with our language, but we're certainly going through a completely changed environment around how we socialise and how we interact with people. And we're also potentially going to go through, which I guess potentially might be an optimistic word, we're going to go through an economic situation after that. So there's actually two phases that we need to think about when we're communicating. And this is very much around building our strong communication through these phases that continues afterwards. Because the last thing we want to do, and I'll talk about this a bit later, is ramp up our communication during the current COVID situation or during a recession and then drop off when we go back to some kind of normal. So it is around really creating storytelling and creating a sustainable communication approach that we can take through to the future. And we'll go through some of the research and you'll see why authenticity is so important at this time. But it's making sure that each time that we communicate, each time we send out a message, how we communicate, we're doing it authentically. And one of the ways we do it authentically is through storytelling. And I'll talk about why storytelling will be so important. As I said, we'll look at some do's and don'ts. And as you know, this is very much about the now, but what will get us through the next stages. So a little bit about myself. I'm just going to move my screen around a bit. So for Fetching Events and Communications, for those of you who don't know us, we're a boutique agency specialising in communications, project management, event management and volunteer management. And for us, engagement is so important. It's not around running a campaign that necessarily hits the amount of eyeballs that we wanted it to see, but it's that it actually engaged. It's not about just an event running on time, but it's about the event actually meeting our purpose and doing that by engaging authentically. So we've got over 20 years experience, or I do, as the founder, in events, communications industry, major events, private sector, government and not-for-profit. And we're really committed to working with community-minded organisations that we believe in, that we're passionate about, and that integrate with our brand values of excellence, success, compassion and spirit. And we'll talk a little bit about values when we get to the purpose section, because it's really important that we just keep referring back to our values and reminding ourselves of why our customers came to us in the first place. So a little bit about myself. Anyone who knows me probably knows I like to chat, but I have a passion for valuable conversations. I've got a background in media arts. I've worked in media organisations from Channel 9 through to Granada TV. I've worked in media operations at events like the tennis, the Sydney Olympics, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. I've also been the marketing manager at the National Trust of Australia. I've been a communications director in an ad agency. So it's very varied. And through all those experiences, what I have paid attention to is how people engage, no matter on who the audience is. And I guess that's something for us to remember, that you may have different audiences. You might be looking at communicating to members, to volunteers, to customers. So my passion is how we communicate and how we do it valuably and to create that long-term relationship. So the single biggest problem in communications is the illusion it has taken place. Now, this isn't a new quote. It's certainly one that's you know, relevant at all times, but now more than ever, it's really relevant. And if you think about when COVID first hit, and I'm sure in your email inboxes, you got a flurry of emails. You got an email from your gym saying that, you know, they were no longer operating, but you could access services online. You might have got an email from a bookshop that you're a member of saying, we will now be doing deliveries. You might have got an email from another online shopping or an association you're a member of. Because I certainly know you, when those first couple of weeks, or those couple of weeks in March, when all the restrictions started coming in, that I seemed to get 10 emails each day from people telling me what they were doing, how they were pivoting, the buzzword. And I can tell you probably about 95% of those organisations I've never heard from again. In the 6 weeks since, I've not heard a peep out of them. So what we need to make sure is that we are actually communicating, that an email you sent 6 weeks ago isn't enough. We've got to constantly be engaging. And engagement is always important, not just now, but what we don't want to do is throw out all our good practice out the window because we're in a different situation. It's really about getting back to basics and not making assumptions that, well, we've put a Facebook post up so they've seen it, or, well, we sent one email so they know what we're doing. We need to constantly engage. So speaking of engagement, I'm going to do a little poll. Let me just launch this. So first, just to get an idea of, has your business or your services or products changed due to COVID? So it might be that they've completely changed. Yeah, so I think 100% have. So I'll just wait a couple more seconds for people to vote in that. Okay, so if we just look at the results of that poll, so we've got 100% of you on the line here have indicated that your businesses and services and products have changed due to COVID. Okay. So if we go to the next poll, which I'm just going to launch now, so keeping in mind that your service has changed, have you increased or decreased your communications since COVID? And I'll just give people some time to vote there. If I share the results there, so if we have a look, that we know 100% of businesses or services that are joining us today have had to change or have been impacted by COVID, 75% have increased their communications and 25% have decreased. So let's just keep that in mind when we continue through our webinar. So marketing is no longer about the stuff you make, but the stories you tell. And once again, this isn't a new quote, but it's something for us to all keep in mind. And no doubt you've seen communication that's been happening over the last 6 weeks or more, and communication that's caught your eye is the ones that are using storytelling. Because, and we'll go into the research shortly, people are really valuing contribution. In a time where people are feeling very disconnected, very isolated, they're craving storytelling. And they're craving storytelling that actually talks to the purpose of the organisation that's sending it to them. So as I said, to understand how to communicate, it is important to understand the context and the time and the sentiment that we're currently experiencing. And this is around understanding your customers. So we're going right back to basics of good communication is understanding what our customers are going through, understanding our customers' needs, understanding our customers' problems, because our communication should be about fulfilling their need, solving their problem and not solving ours. And I'll give you some examples as we go along of well-meaning communication, but was clearly the problem and the worry and the anxiety of the organisation projecting it through the communication they sent. Now, one thing we also need to keep in mind is this is a constantly changing environment. And at the moment, we'll potentially have a country that's split in how they're feeling, because we will have parts of Australia that are still in restrictions and we'll have ones that are starting to come out of it. So we just need to keep that in mind, that we've got to be careful with our communication because it won't be necessarily a one size fits all. So instead of focusing on the competition, focus on the customer. And we've just talked about that this very much is around solidifying our relationship with our customer. And I say customer, but it's our audience, because it's going to be easier to retain and build our existing audience rather than go after new acquisitions at a time like this. So the current mood. So research is showing that the current mood is that people are feeling isolated, they're feeling uncertain, they're feeling hopeful but stressed, they're feeling optimistic but anxious, They're feeling motivated but frustrated. And I'm sure none of this is new to you, and anyone who joined me in the webinar last week would be familiar with this. And this will constantly change. Now, I'm sure we've all felt these emotions during the last 6 weeks. In fact, you may have felt them all during the last day. So, but the key thing is that people are feeling very disconnected. They're feeling frustrated because they're not connected. They're feeling isolated. Yet they do have optimism and they do have hopefulness and they are motivated. So there's things that we can tie into that about filling that gap of isolation and disconnection by connecting with our communications and presenting it in that hopeful and optimistic lens that will really have that authenticity that people are looking for. As I said, everyone is experiencing this differently, in fact, across the state, but each demographic is experiencing it differently. And research is showing that there's two distinct groups that are feeling most impacted at the moment. This is probably no surprise. Young families and small business owners. And in fact, there's a lot of research that is showing that Gen Xers, and I'm not sure if there's any other Gen Xers on the line like myself, Gen Xers are feeling they're bearing the brunt of it, that they're sandwiched in the middle between the baby boomers and the Gen Ys and the millennials. So within your audience, you're going to have people experiencing it differently. Social recession. There's a lot of talk about a social recession because people have lost that human-to-human interaction. And the longer we go without human interaction, the deeper the impact. So, and I'm not sure this is no surprise to any of you as we're all potentially working from home today, is that people are craving connection and they're craving information. And you probably, it doesn't take long to go on LinkedIn and see the amount of webinars like this that are being offered, the amount of blogs that people are writing, the amount of coffee catch-ups that are happening. And I'm sure for many of you, you've probably connected with people that you haven't connected with for years, or you haven't had the time to catch up, but people are doing it now because they're craving that connection. So this is something, again, that just reinforces why communication will be so important at this time. So what are people looking for? So we've said connection. They're looking for safe, helpful and supportive environments. Now that doesn't mean it needs to be a support charity, but within the community and the person that's communicating to them, that's what they're looking for. They don't want asks. They don't want to necessarily be sold stuff. Of course, we all want to buy stuff, but they want it positioned in that safe, helpful, supportive lens and around connection. And if you want to just pop in the chat box now, for those of you who potentially increased your communication, have you seen an increase in engagement during this time? Whether on your social media or in your e-news, if you do an EDM, have you seen an increase in the uptake in this? And feel free to just make some comments. I know certainly for myself, my e-news, which I have moved from a monthly e-news to a weekly at the moment, has got higher engagement than it ever has. Yep, Faye, fantastic. Because people are craving for information. Everyone's at home, or most people are at home, they're isolated, they're disconnected. So they are soaking up information and they're soaking up communication. I know a lot of organisations whose social media has grown incredibly over the last 6 weeks. And in fact, a colleague of mine was in a webinar with a zoo that's based in the UK, and they've been doing some live zoo streamings, which many zoos around the world are doing. Their social media audience has grown from 500,000 to 1 million during this time. So what we can do, if we do strong communication and our social media or our EDMs organically grow, not only are we solidifying, as I said, that relationship to our existing customers and audience base, it will grow and naturally expand with their referrals. So I'm sure many of you have shared things on Facebook that you've seen, or you've had things shared to you. This is your customer base are your best referrals. Fantastic. We've got yet more open communication. People have increased their EDMs. Really have a look at your engagement numbers, and I'll certainly give an example as we go through. Here we go. A volume of communications has not grown or decreased, but website visits have increased and the type of direct comms has changed. So if you start to look at your own data, because we've actually got really, really good value within our own statistics. So what else do people want? And this is, as I said, this can change, but this is at the moment, they want to make a difference. Self-improvement is a big thing. They're looking for more meaning-focused things. They're looking for learning. So once again, how can your organisation or your brand talk to that in your communications? And how can your storytelling tie into that as well? Human connection, which we've talked about, localised. Now, we will start to be very localised when the restrictions start to ease, because we'll be forced to be localised. We'll be neighbourhood focused, community focused. Now that's not just geographically, but the community that you're in, you know, whether that's a membership community. And I know a lot of great membership organisations are doing coffee catch-ups. They're doing Zoom meetings that they've never done before to bring together their members, that are hugely effective in building that loyalty and showing their value to their customer. And this is really where your communication comes in, because if you can communicate authentically, talk to these points that we know people are experiencing and show your value, you will really solidify that loyalty and that relationship. Oops. So there'll be a trend towards leaner. People will be looking for more focused things. They'll be more considered, be more purpose driven. And that's something for us to think about when we go to our purpose. So we've looked at what the current sentiment is now. We'll have a quick look at history. And this is probably no surprise because you're on this webinar, is that organisations that invest in marketing roar out of recessions. And there's a really good article by the Harvard Business Review called Roaring Out of Recession, which you can easily find with a quick Google search. And this was conducted after the GFC, and they looked at a whole range of companies and did quite a thorough study of what it was that companies that not only survived the GFC but excelled out of it, what they had done differently to put them in that situation. And one of the key things was marketing and investing in that marketing. Strong communication. We know strong communication builds loyalty. And staying customer centric. And as I said before, this is about ensuring that our customer relationships outlast Corona or outlast the recession. And it's not just about saying we're customer focused, it's about delivering on that in our services as well. So we've looked at the current sentiment. We've looked at what we know from history. So we know people are feeling isolated, but there is optimism. We know they're looking for more purpose. We know that they're looking for more meaningful, but they need connection. So let's just go back to our purpose, or your purpose. So if people believe they share values with a company, they will stay loyal to the brand. And this is a time to really stick to your purpose. And I'll give you some examples as we go along. But if we look at, say, recessions or something like bushfires or a global health crisis, there's many charities that actually are hugely successful and really grow out of these times, because suddenly the need for those organisations becomes visible. So organisations that we've perhaps taken for granted, suddenly we see why there's a need for them. This is also happening with roles. So this is a time where actual contribution is being valued and recognised more. So if we look at roles such as shelf stackers in a supermarket, cleaners, delivery drivers, roles that we've taken for granted, we are now seeing how essential those roles are. And it's the actual contribution that is being valued and recognised more. And why that is because people are looking for purpose. They're looking for connection. And if they actually see contribution, it resonates with them. So this is the time to show the value of your organisation, to go right back to your purpose. Why did people engage with you in the first place? What was it that attracted people to your organisation? What is it in your values and purposes that resonates, that have created that customer base and that loyalty? And what is it from that that you can pull out to create your storytelling and your communication during this time? Because this isn't the time to stray away from that. And often in a crisis, people react in a way of, we've just got to start something new. And they actually forget all the basics they've got in place. And I'll show you some examples as we go through. So let's talk about communication. So we've talked about how people are feeling. We've talked about what we know from history. We're understanding our customer. We know why they've come to us, because of our purpose. Now we want to be that loyal friend and that organisation during this time, because we want to be the brand or the association that was there the whole time. We don't want to go quiet. We don't want to go silent, because once your audience is gone, there's no guarantee of getting them back. And I put it in the terms of, don't be the fair weather friend. We don't want to be the brand that disappears in the hard times, and maybe we were too scared to contact our customer because we didn't want to bother them, or we didn't know the right things to say and we just waited till this passed, and then at the end we went, hi, we're back. It's too late. People will have moved their loyalty, and they won't necessarily have moved it because they feel you've deserted them. It's that someone will have filled your place. So what we need to do is be present the whole time, because I said, if you're not there, customers will form their loyalty somewhere else. And I heard a great quote recently in regards to fundraising, for charities fundraising during a time of recession or over a time like now. And they said, if you're not in market, people will still donate. They just won't donate to you. So this is very much being about that loyal friend that stays with your audience and is by their side the whole way through. Oops, skipping ahead there. So selling to, sorry, my screen's very funny. Selling to people who actually want to hear from you is more effective than interrupting strangers who don't. Once again, not a new quote, but I love this because it just brings us back to focusing on our customers. This isn't a time to throw all our strategy out the window and start to go for a whole new audience. This is a time to go back to the people that have been hearing from us, who've wanted to hear from us, rather than interrupting the strangers who don't. So I'm now going to do another poll. And this is about how you're communicating with your customers at the moment. You can do multiple answers. So bear in mind that when you think about customers, it can be your members, it can be your clients, it can be your guests, but just starting to think about how you're communicating with them at the moment. And I'll just give it a few more seconds for people to cast their votes. Okay, so if we look at the votes, everyone's doing social media, which is fantastic. And of course, we're all, well, once again, I shouldn't say all, most of us are at home. We're not going out. So what are we doing? We're spending time on our computers. We're spending time on our phones. We're spending time watching TV. And in fact, free-to-air TV has had some of the biggest ratings they have recently because we're forced into an environment. We're not going out. We're in front of the TV. EDMs, fantastic. Website, fantastic. And I'll give you some examples of that. Direct mail. I love that people are doing, I've said hand copies, should be hard copies. And I'm interested to know who's doing direct mails, because that's a really key thing. When so much of our engagement is online, how nice would it be to just receive something in the post? We've got a really, as a colleague of mine says, a digital bottleneck at the moment. So think about when you're communicating, how can you do it in different ways? And direct mail is a great way. And I know if I received an IKEA catalogue at the moment, I would soak that catalogue up and I would read that from back cover, you know, front cover to back cover and back again, because we want things that aren't just digital. It's a tangible thing. So think about, are there things that you could do in hard copy, direct mail? Some of you were on a webinar last week about volunteer engagement, and one thing I talked about is send your volunteers a card. Send them a card saying, we miss you. We can't wait to see you again, and we value the contribution that you make. From a personal point of view, I've gone and bought a whole lot of postcards for Melbourne. I'm based in Melbourne, to send my family who are in Melbourne. But gosh, I mean, we're all on a staycation of sorts, not the staycation we wanted, but how nice to actually receive something in the post. So think about different ways you can be communicating. TV, fantastic. Radio, fantastic. Phone calls. I love that 73% of you are making phone calls, because there's nothing more personal than just a phone call. And in a time where we're doing everything on Zoom, and I know how exhausting Zoom can be, and there's actually a lot of research about how exhausting online engagement can be, that the old-fashioned phone call can go so far. Online catch-ups, fantastic. Professional development. People are craving, and if it's right for your audience, people are craving professional development now. And it doesn't necessarily need to be, I shouldn't say perhaps professional, but personal development as well. And I'll give an example of a video that's gone gangbusters based on that, and blogs, fantastic. So lots of different ways that we can be communicating. So we've looked at the current state, we've looked at history, we've gone back to our purpose, and now we're looking at how do we be that loyal friend. I'm going to step through some stages that we need to bear in mind. And if we consider that our customers or our audience is the friend that's going through grief, because in a sense, this is what many are going through. Not everyone, but we do need to keep this in mind. So your customers will go through different phases. You know, those 5 phases of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. We've probably all gone through the denial of COVID, and the denial that it was happening and what it would mean. I'm sure for many parents at home, homeschooling, they probably have gone through, or they're going through the anger stage. For people whose jobs have been impacted, will be going through that. We may go through these stages again when we get deeper into what the economic impact is. We also need to be sensitive to emotions and needs around how quickly this situation moves. What was relevant for week 1 will be different to what is relevant for week 4, week 8, week 12. And I talked about that earlier, about that flurry of emails I got in those first couple of weeks of COVID in March that I've not heard from since. But if they sent an email now, it would need to be very different in how they're phrasing it to those first emails. That week 1 was really about what this impact is. If we look at an event point of view, that week 1 was the event's been postponed, but we look forward to bringing it to you at a rescheduled date. You know, maybe week 3 was, we're excited to say, you know, to announce the new date, and we can't wait to see you there. Week 8, the whole focus is on that new event. We don't go back to COVID. We don't mention it again. We've moved on. So you need to start making sure that your communication is adapting as the environment around us adapts. So continually update your messaging and make it relevant. And ensure your communications are sensitive to these, and ensure, as I said earlier, you're not projecting your emotions into your communications. And there's a lot of it, and you've probably seen it yourself. Communication very much has projected perhaps the anxiety of the organisation and maybe the effect that COVID's having on them, and it's come through in their communication. So I'll give you some examples here. The first example is an email I received. Now, it was pre the restrictions being put in place, but it was certainly when we knew events would be impacted. And this is from an event booking, an online agency, that sent this email that screamed to me that they were freaking out. So now, I should say a lot of these points are valid around what we operationally needed to do, but when they were using language like high risk, backfire, financial risk, it was screaming to me that this is how they were feeling, and there's a completely different way they could have gone around it. The line, major events all around the world are being cancelled, was a completely throwaway line, because in fact it had no basis on what was happening in Australia. The amount of messages I had when Dark Mofo in Tasmania was cancelled was, well, they've cancelled, so we'll need to cancel. But it was very reactive, it was very inflammatory. So there was ways that they could have handled that without projecting their anxiety. Then let's have a look at the next one. This is from the National Trust, of which I'm a volunteer. The first email that came out wasn't inflammatory, it wasn't panicky, even though we knew all the National Trust properties would close, but they understood their customer, and they understood how we may have been feeling as a volunteer or a staff member. And the simple subject line was, your health and well-being is our priority. This is an email from the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. Now, they've understood the emotions that are going on, and they've tapped into that hope. So they understand we're going through a time of fear and uncertainty, and they've used those words. And what I would say is those words were probably relevant for the first couple of weeks, something that we completely move away from using those words. But they put, because of you, there is hope. So they've also tapped in the fact that people will be wanting to make a difference. We're feeling disconnected, we're feeling helpless. But they've just given me a reason to donate, because they're saying, because of me, I can give hope and I can make an actual contribution. So we start to see how important language can be at a time like this. Here's another example from Asana, or anyone who uses the Asana online management tool. They sent a fantastic email really early on when other organisations were starting to freak out. They sent one, and the simple line was, "We're here for you." They didn't use any inflammatory language. They didn't talk about a crisis, but they talked about adapting. Now, adapting can be quite a positive word. They talked about clarity. So they talked about how they understood what people were going through and that people were moving to work from home. Nowhere in that email was there an ask, but it just solidified how Asana could help me during this time. Oops. A couple of other ones, if you haven't already seen them, I recommend you hop online after this webinar to tune in. Is the Tourism Australia has a fantastic ad called "With Love from Australia," and it basically talks about a funny thing happened on the way home from work and we pretty much closed. But it gives us a really uplifting outlook of what will happen when we reopen. And it talks about what's happening while we're all staying home and staying safe, that the fruit is fattening, that the beaches are glistening, you know, that the animals are getting cuter. And it just taps into every emotion we're feeling. I don't know if any of you've seen the Uber ad, but once again, I recommend hopping online to see this and to watch this. And I remember when I first saw it on TV that it stopped me in my tracks because I wanted to know which brand this was. And it's vision of people in home. Some are looking lonely, you know, sort of glancing out the window. Some are holding signs saying we love you and we miss you. It's uplifting, but it doesn't, you know, deny the fact that we're going through the situation. And it finishes with Uber saying, "Thank you for not riding with Uber and thank you for staying home." Once again, they've understood how their customers are feeling. So I really recommend you hop online after this to have a look. So the next thing we need to think about is do not overwhelm. And this is really where it's a balance, because we need to keep in touch with our audience, but it's equally important not to overwhelm them. And this is where we need to ensure that we monitor the amount of times we engage and put ourselves in our customer's shoes. Consider the amount of emails you are sending or social media posts that you are posting. Consider how often you would want to be communicated to, and look at previous successes. So look at your current data. You'll be able to see if you're communicating too much with EDMs, your unsubscribes will start to go up, or your engagement will start to lessen. Look at your social media. Look at which posts are getting the best engagement, and maybe your engagement's dropping because you're posting too much. So you can look at your own analytics around that. What we do want to be at this time is approachable and relatable. So we've talked about people want connection. They're more focused, purpose-driven. They want meaning. So, and they're disconnected. They want connection. So this is where we can be approachable and relatable. And our communication has to be useful. It has to engage. We don't want to just set up a coffee catch-up for the sake of it, or send an email for the sake of it because we're trying to keep in touch. There has to be some purpose. It doesn't have to be much. It might be a simple update. It might be a simple "we miss you." It might be a simple we can't wait to tell you what we've got in store, or this is what we're doing while we're all at home. And I'll give you some examples of this, because people will be more focused with their time. And I know a large national networking group I'm in, I seem to receive an email from them every day about a new webinar to attend. And that's fantastic, certainly all valuable webinars, but I'm starting to feel overwhelmed that every day in my inbox I'm getting another email and then another email, and then you need to attend this and learn this. And that can be really overwhelming. And what I'm finding is I'm not even reading. They could have the best content in those emails, but I'm just hitting delete straight away because it's too much at the moment. So let's have a look at some examples. This is a great email from an association that sent this email out. They recognised that they'd been sending weekly updates because of the ever-changing environment. They've talked about how they're organising the content so it's easy for you because they're understanding how their customer's feeling. And then they talk about we've taken time to look up. So rather than overwhelmed, they've actually been really clear in their messaging about how they're communicating and why they're communicating. And that can be something you do. If you change your EDMs from monthly to weekly, tell people why you're doing that, because then they understand. The next thing we need to acknowledge is, or talk about, is acknowledge but don't focus on the negative. Certainly we can't deny the fact that we're going through a pandemic and a current global health situation, but what we don't want to do is always talk about COVID. And I'm, even in this webinar series, really careful to talk about that we're adapting rather than going through crisis. So acknowledge the pandemic in those early communications, but you don't need to always dwell on it. Don't anchor yourself to the crisis, because if you anchor yourself to this crisis, you're going to have a hard time coming out of it, because people will just see you as the one that just focused on this. So what we've got to do is show your relevance during and after the crisis, and do that through your communication and your storytelling. And when going through tough times, just think about, you know, personally, if you've gone through a tough time, it's the friend that acknowledges the situation but doesn't harp on about it that we value the most. We don't want to keep being reminded of what we're in. And Australians are responding to brands that are there in the tough times and the hard times, as opposed to just the good times. And the brands that aren't just stuck in COVID, it's the brands that are moving forward. And I'll give you some examples on that. So this is an email from a venue company. It's a company that owns a lot of pubs and venues around Australia. Now, there's no denying COVID because they're shut because of COVID. They have no operations happening. They've acknowledged it while apart, but they're not focusing on the negative. So the simple subject of while apart, we're still together. And then what they've done in their e-news is they've highlighted 2 of their staff members and what they're doing in this time. And that's a fantastic way, because in essence, there's not much a venue can do at the moment. They can't, you know, try and drive business, even though people are still planning ahead. They've got to be very careful with their positioning, but they don't want to go cold. They don't want to go dark, and they don't want to go silent. So they've found a way to keep in touch by acknowledging we're apart, by creating that loyalty and showing that if we go back to that supportive, that safe, that helpful connection, an environment that people are looking for, and they've gone through that simple subject line, and then they've created the storyline and that personal storytelling and that authenticity. Remember, we know that research has shown that people are valuing actual contribution, and they've done that through telling stories of their staff. Some not so good examples. And as an event manager, this frustrated me hugely when COVID first hit, because the event industry kept talking about how we were decimated, and the events industry has been decimated. Now, yes, we've been disrupted, but in reality, every industry has been disrupted. But if you keep using the language like decimate, what message are you sending your customers? And as someone in the event industry, if my peak body is saying that my industry is decimated, how am I going to feel? And then how are we going to build the confidence of our industry and our audience if we've told them it's gone, that it's decimated? So be really careful with language. Another one is this, I nearly ran off the road when I saw this. It's an auction board for a school, an open house, which obviously has been cancelled. But to have a banner slapped on that open house with cancelled in capital letters is just, it just screamed at me. And there's so many ways they could have positioned that in a lot more, in a positive light. And they could have had some really effective language rather than just cancelled. Because in essence, the school's not cancelling their registrations. They'll still be taking student enrolments, but that just blanket and very harsh cancellation sends a very different message. So the next thing is do not assume, and this is a key one. There is a tendency to assume that people want to be left alone, particularly if their business has been impacted. And I certainly talk about that in a sense of sponsors, because I've had many conversations where people have said, and organisations have said, well, we won't be able to get sponsors. But have you actually chatted to your sponsor? You know, they're your customer, they're your audience. So don't jump to the conclusion that they won't have the funds or capacity to partner with you or want to be involved. Actually have the conversation and ask them. Because we know, many brands know, that if you invest in marketing, you'll come out the other side and you'll come out stronger. So brands will be wanting to do that. So start to think how you can work with your sponsors or your supporters rather than just assuming that they want to be left alone. And I'll give you some examples here. This is a Bastille Day French festival that I work with. Bastille Day, so 14th of July, we've had to cancel. But what we've done is gone right back to our purpose of why are people, what attracts people to our festival. Yes, they come for the lovely food, but they come because they're either from the French community or they have a love of French things. So we have started up our EDMs again. We sent this out yesterday. We acknowledged the fact that we miss them, that we miss the adrenaline and the buzz of planning this great festival. But over the next few months, or even longer before next year's festival, we're going to start sending them easy things they can do at home to stay connected to the French community. So a simple thing like brush up with your French. We featured one of the stall holders, so we know that people come to the French festival. One of the reasons they come is to purchase from our French market, and someone like France at Home, which is a French supermarket. So we have included them at no cost in our EDM. Now, what it's doing, we understand our customers' needs. They're stuck at home. They're going to miss out on this great festival. But now we've given them an opportunity and highlighted that they can still access these stuff by ordering them online. We've built a relationship with our stall holder, France at Home, because they've seen that we valued them and put them in our EDM at no cost. So naturally, that's going to strengthen our relationship with them. I think they had a sale within an hour of the EDM going out. And that EDM has been one of our highest engagement, not only in our open rates, but in our click-throughs of all our EDMs going, 12 months ago. So people want to be contacted and companies want to be involved. So think about how you can involve maybe existing sponsors or supporters, or whichever audience you're looking at, ways you can involve them to really build up that connection. And as I said, the value of that campaign is we went right back to our purpose. We didn't try and reinvent it and offer them things that didn't relate to the French festival. So stick to your purpose. We've talked about how important purpose is and getting back to basics, but at a time when the world is experiencing a global crisis, there is a tendency to try and solve everyone's problems. And what we don't want to be that brand or organisation that tries to solve problems that we aren't actually involved in. So stick to your mission. Your business may have pivoted, and I'll give you some examples, but your reason for being hasn't. So ensure your communications matches this. So this email, are you okay? So the subject line came through in the first week of COVID. Are you okay? How can we help? This is from a dog country club that we take our dog to. And their messaging was, when we know when we message you, it's normally about the health and well-being of your four-legged family friends, but this time we wanted to reach out and see how you're going. And then they proceeded in a very well-meaning way to offer to buy groceries for people, to be a support line. Wonderful, well-meaning things, but so far off what their brand is that not only it diluted and confused their communication, it potentially put them in a very dangerous position of providing a support line that they're actually not trained for. I like the sentiment, but what I could sense was they weren't okay. And so they were projecting that onto us. And do you think I've heard from them again? No. So I've had this one email asking, am I okay? And offering me all these services. And then I've not heard from them one more time during this situation. So it really is making sure we stick to our purpose. Just give this little example of a whiskey distillery, and there's a lot of gin and whiskey distilleries that have pivoted to hand sanitizer. But what I really like is the way that Ned Whiskey has positioned themselves. So they've pivoted, they've started making hand sanitizer, but they've gently pulled into their communication that they're still a whiskey company. So stay safe, stay positive. That's the spirit. And I think that's a really lovely way of tying it in. So they pivot to hand sanitizer. Their messaging continues with the hand sanitizer, but then they gently put in a post that our distillery may be pumping with sanitizer, but have no fear, we still have plenty of whiskey in stock. Then they talk about if you're a charity or an organisation that works on the front line or with, you know, at-risk communities, we can provide hand sanitizer to you. Then they start to bring whiskey back into their social media because the message is out there that they're selling hand sanitizer. Everyone knows that. But how do they start to pivot and get back to Ned whiskey is they do it along with the hand sanitizer. So if you look at their Instagram feed, it's not a jump, it's a merge. So now they're talking about Ned essentials, a bottle of whiskey and hand sanitizer. So I ordered a whole lot of hand sanitizer through them when we couldn't get hand sanitizer anywhere. Then I recently got an email from them thanking me for my purchase of hand sanitizer. And I've never bought whiskey from them, I should say. I've never been a customer of them. Then they go on to talk about how overwhelmed they were by everyone's support and what that support meant. So by everyone buying so much, they were able to distribute 6,000 bottles to organisations and charities. And then to thank me, they're giving me a 20% discount on my next order. And you know what? Maybe I will order whiskey the next time. So they've really positioned it well because even though they've pivoted, they've still stuck to their purpose and managed to keep the identity of Ned whiskey in there the whole time because they know when this ends, people won't have the need for hand sanitizer that they have now. So they're positioning themselves for when we start to come out of it. The next thing they've done is made sure it all sits in on their website. So I'm sure a lot of organisations that you've seen have done some fantastic Facebook and social media, but you go to their website and there's not one mention about their change in business. So if you go to the Ned Whiskey website, hand sanitizer is there. If you go to the Goodwill page, it talks about the charity donations. So they've tied and made sure that all their communications aligns. This one has missed a great opportunity. So this is a gourmet pub near where I live that obviously has had to close, but they've pivoted in a fantastic way and become a gourmet grocer. If you look at their Instagram feed, all it talks about is their gourmet groceries. You can buy the groceries and make the recipes that the chef cooks on site. But if you go to their menu, it still looks like that they're an operating pub. There's a reservations line. I'm not going to make a reservation. It talks about the pub meals, it talks about the chef, it talks about their menu. They actually haven't tied in what they're doing in their social media communications with their website. So if there's one thing that you take away from today is go back to your website. Does it reflect what you're actually doing? Next one is acknowledge the elephant in the room. And this is around if you decide to start up engagement. So maybe you've never sent an e-news or it's been a year since you sent an e-news and you decide, well, actually now's the time to do that. Don't just send it and not acknowledge why there's been a gap or not acknowledge the fact that you're getting back in touch. Actually explain the absence. And, if you think of that fair weather friend that just gets back in touch with you, actually talk about why you got back in touch. And I'll give you some examples about this. This is a really good email I got from an online event, what I call it, like a stock and professional development online site. Now, I haven't received an email from them in 2 years, but she positioned that, she knew that, and she addressed that head on. So she wrote in the title, I've missed you and we're back. And then she talked about there's been a 2-year hiatus, and she told me why there's been a 2-year hiatus. And then she told me why it was important that she felt she needed to get back in touch. So I don't care that I've never heard, I haven't heard from her for 2 years and suddenly I get an email, because she's told me why. And that communicates with me because it's authentic. If we put this in contrast to this email that I received from a gym that I was a member of 7 years ago. I have not been involved with that gym for 7 years. And I got this email with no introduction, no explanation, not even telling me, what's happening at the gym or acknowledging that I haven't been involved, but maybe I'd like to do some work at home. So really looking at with your communications. You know, whether it's a coffee catch-up, if you're doing the coffee catch-up for the first time, explain why you're doing it. Make sure that you do acknowledge that elephant in the room. This email's come from a venue management company that obviously are closed, but they've pivoted their catering to do home catering, which I think is fantastic, and I love everything they're doing. But to me, they've missed a fantastic opportunity to acknowledge why they're now doing Mother's Day hampers. That's all I got in the email, and then order now. The storytelling they could have tied in around this year, when we may not be able to come together with our families, why not surprise your mum and treat her with one of our famous gourmet hampers? And they could have really connected with me and really had that authenticity, but instead I just get sent this quite cold email with no reference of why they're sending it. So next we've got, and we've talked about this a bit, but sticking with them during the tough times. So it's crucial that we don't desert our customers during the tough times. And we've talked about already how people are seeing engagement increase. Companies, it'll be too late to come back during the happy times. This is a time where people are thirsty to be connected. They're craving that contact. And this is where we can step in, and this is where you can come together. I read a quote recently that regardless of how business has been impacted by current events, your customers are grappling with what's happening. So your role in their lives will need to adjust. This is where we can step in and fill that void with great communication, and you'll be rewarded not only at the end, but long term. And bearing in mind, this is a marathon, not a sprint, long term, because you've been there the whole way. Just some examples of, Bastille Day, when we changed. So we'd done our cancellation post and how sorry we were, but when we changed our profile picture to just the image with next year's date, that got huge engagement because people realised we're committed for next year. We've done posts about time back into, what were your favourite memories. This one down the bottom, I'm not sure if any of you have seen, it was a scone video that was filmed not for this, it was filmed previously for the CWA, and for whatever reason it didn't get great engagement. It was, I think, during a campaign called Sconversations. Somehow it's recently been shared and it's now been seen by over 4.6 million viewers, because what's everyone doing? They're stuck at home cooking. So start to see what it is that you can do during these tough times that will connect. This one down here with the Sydney Opera House is Accor Hotels. Now, I mean, no one's booking holidays to go to hotels at the moment. What are they doing? They're live streaming from some of their hotel rooms so you can take in the view. Now, if I'm, a rainy day in Melbourne and I'm feeling a bit glum and I'm stuck at home, so I go on and I start looking at the view from one of their hotel rooms in the Gold Coast, what am I going to do when I look to book my domestic holiday? I'm going to go straight back to that hotel. So once again, they've understood their customers. Even though their hotels aren't operating like they usually do, they haven't gone quiet, they haven't gone dark. They're giving people hope. So we know people want hope. They're making them feel connected. They're giving them a breath of fresh air. So think how you can stick with your customers during this time. And we've seen it from, I think musicians in the arts industry have done it so well. Vicar and Linda Bull, they did the Nutbush, and I think it's up to 57,000 likes. And I'd be curious to see what their social media following was pre this. The MSO has gone on, their show must go on. So they're not they're not overtly talking about COVID, but they're implying that there's some reason they couldn't go on, but they've said we're still going to go on. So they're still sticking with us during this time. This is a newsletter from the Arts Centre, and we may even have some on the line today. Venues are closed, they're not taking bookings, but they've sent out a fantastic EDM talking about, while the curtain is down, the team are still at work. So I know as an event manager that I can still contact them. They haven't gone quiet. While our curtains are drawn, the show will go on with a series of free archival recordings and digital experiences. They're still giving people that experience, and they're offering them something. They're talking, that the blog takes a different angle this month. They've been open and upfront and honest about that. So think about how you can do that with your engagement. Finally, we've got Plan for a Changed Relationship. And as I've said all along, this is very much about creating and engaging with our audience that will see us through. It's not about changing up our communication and then changing back at the end. It's about how we can position ourselves, how we can engage authentically and tie in our storytelling, because coming out of this, people will still want that. We don't know how long. Maybe we'll go back to normal society, or maybe it will make a major change with us. But how can we look to stay with our customer this whole time? So going back to what we talked about earlier, the more advocates you have, the fewer ads you have to buy. So it's just a reminder to really solidify our relationship with our existing customers, because they're our advocates. And if we can communicate correctly with them, they will spread the word for us. So we've talked about what's happening at the moment, we've talked about the past, we've talked about what we can be to be a loyal friend. And there are green shoots that will come out of COVID and the economic situation. Customer relations will be more focused than ever. And we've talked about that. People want connection. People want, we'll come out of this leaner. They'll be more purpose driven. So our customer relations will fit that. There's optimism. There's legacies that will come out of that. And how can your organisation or your brand be one of those legacies and be one of those brands that really stepped up during this time with your communication? We can all be part of the future, and to me that's really exciting, because you can really guide that and shape that with your communications. And as I said, people will be valued for the contribution they make. So what contribution does your organisation or your brand make, and how can you put that forward in your communication, because that's what will be valued. And I always like to finish with this quote. I've learned that people forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So how are you making your customers, how are you making your audience feel during this? Are they feeling valued? Are they feeling safe? Do they feel you're helpful? And how can you do that? And as we talked about earlier, there's so many ways you can do it, whether it's through that old-fashioned personal phone call, whether it's a webinar, whether it's making scones, if that's relevant to your brand, or it's a more professional one. Because if you can offer things to people, you will show the value of your organisation and your brand. And what we know, as I say it again, is people are acknowledging and valuing contribution. So if you can make that contribution, they will really become loyal to you. Try and think what different things you can do out of the digital bottleneck, does something different, like a direct mail, that will really talk to people. And not only talk to them, they'll share it, and they'll become your advocates. So that's quite a bit that we've covered through the last hour, but as I said, if there's anything that you do take away from this, is really to get back to your purpose. Get back to why your customers came to you in the first place. Then start to think about, what are your customers going through? What are their challenges at the moment? And how can you solve their problems? And then how can your storytelling and your communication tie back into your purpose, talk to their disconnection, but talk to their optimism, and how can you tie it back in your communication? So thank you so much for joining me. And I know we've probably just gone over, but I've still got time for questions. If anyone wants to pop some questions in the chat box, certainly feel free to. As I said, for me, this is part of a webinar series where I'm really keen to look at how we adapt and adjust during 2020, because it won't just be the health crisis. We potentially will have, the economic situation we'll come into next. And the next webinar that I'll be running on this will be next Friday, and that'll be about event planning in a new world. So certainly if you're planning events, that will be one to pop into. And if you don't already follow us or connect with us, here's our social media. And if you'd like to subscribe to our e-news, if you don't already receive it, feel free to head to our website and log on there. So as I said, I've still got some time for questions, but I'm conscious we've run pretty close to time, but it's been wonderful to have everyone online, and I hope there's some things that you can take away to just sort of assess your communications and see how they can work for you. So thank you again. I wish everyone a fantastic day. Stay safe, stay healthy, and more importantly, stay connected with your customers. So thank you, and hope to see you in our next webinar.